Okay, let's set this up here. Joe Natale is the CEO at the time. They've got him from, he's left TELUS, right, to come to Rogers?
He's been fired from TELUS.
He's been fired from TELUS. He's now with Rogers. And he does not know, but finds out under the most bizarre circumstances, that there is a coup being plotted by Edward and Tony Staffieri, who's CFO
CFO
at the time.
Officer.
And somehow, okay, maybe you should pick up the story here. There's an allegation of a butt-dialed phone call in which Joe hears all about the plot to get him out.
That's
what
right.
do you think really happened there?
So essentially, here's how it goes down. Joe Natale has just signed a deal for Rogers to acquire Shaw Communications. It's a $20 billion deal, right? And this is the deal of Ted Rogers' dreams. When Ted and J.R. Shaw, the founder of Shaw, essentially were building their cable empire simultaneously, there were two kind of infamous handshake deals in which they essentially carved the country into East and West. And people have always anticipated that one day those two Eastern and Western cable families would come together, and Ted had always dreamed of having a national cable empire. And so Joe thinks things are going pretty well, understandably, seeing as he's just signed this deal, and they're now waiting on regulatory approval from not one but three government regulators. And so, my initial understanding, as we reported in the Globe and Mail, was that it was a butt dial. But what I have since learned is that the alleged phone call that took place was actually a butt answer. And that...
Okay, hold that thought right there, because I actually want to read an excerpt from the book in which you touch on this, and then you can pick up the story. Sheldon, bottom of page 2. Let's do this. It was the end of a busy week of investor meetings, and Natale was keen to catch up with Staffieri to discuss an issue involving credit rating agencies in relation to the Shaw deal. He opened a bottle of wine, poured himself a glass, and dialed. Natale found himself on a call with Staffieri, but Staffieri didn't seem to be aware that the call was taking place. Back to you, Alex.
So according to the version of events that has emerged from Joe Natale's camp, and which is now in several sworn court affidavits, is that Staffieri is sitting there and he's talking about his plans for Rogers Communications, how he's going to remake the leadership ranks of the company when he imminently becomes the CEO of Rogers. And, this is like essentially something out of a Hollywood movie, right? That you would accidentally answer a phone call inadvertently at that exact moment. And so, Joe is shocked, and he takes out a pen and paper and he starts scribbling down in detail what Staffieri's plans entail. This, of course, after he attempted to make his presence known to Staffieri, but Staffieri didn't hear him. And so that is one version of events. The other version of events from Tony's camp is that Joe had actually learned of the plan through some other way. There was, in fact, perhaps a phone call. It's unclear whether the call was answered. It's unclear whether, Tony was actually having that kind of a conversation with the company's former chief legal officer. But the allegation from the other camp is that Joe actually went through Tony's private communications, his emails, his text messages, and found out that way.
Now, this gets doubly complicated because the board gets very split on this. Edward Rogers is backing Tony. Some of the other independent directors, like former Premier David Peterson, are backing Joe Natale. How does that drama come to the fore at this moment?
So essentially, Joe goes to Edward and he says he wants to fire Tony Staffieri. He can't trust him. And it's at that point that Edward says to Joe, don't blame Tony. This was not Tony's plan. This was my plan. And I don't agree with firing Tony, but I will work with you on an exit package if you would like to leave. Because, Joe essentially makes a kind of an ultimatum. It's either I go or he goes. And so Joe is taken aback, but, he's lost apparently the confidence of the chair of the board and the chair of the trust. And so
That's Edward.
And so he starts, working with Alan Horn, the company's former chair, on an exit package. And everything seems to be going according to Edward's plan, despite the objections of David Peterson. And then things kind of change. And essentially what ends up happening is that David Peterson makes this impassioned speech at the board, and a number of other directors come forward, and they also have concerns about parting with the CEO at the time when the company is looking to consummate this major deal. And it's not just the CEO that they're going to be parting with. It's also the vast majority of the company's C-suite leadership team who, were also contemplated to be exiting as part of this plan. And so some directors are very concerned that this would be very destabilizing for the company at what is essentially this crucial moment, because nobody in the family disagrees with the plan of acquiring Shaw, right? This is the one thing that everyone is completely allied on, is the importance of this deal.
But this company is in crisis in the midst of the biggest takeover deal in the history of the country.
That's right.
That can't be good.
No, I don't think it can.
Okay, so then the board sort of divvies up, and it becomes Rogers versus Rogers.
That's right.
In court. Okay, explain that. What does that mean?
Well, so what ends up happening is that the board ends up voting to remove Edward as chair, and Edward effectively decides that he's going to replace the independent directors who have gone against him, and he does so through this little-known mechanism called a written shareholder resolution, which people don't realize is possible because Rogers is actually headquartered in British Columbia, which people don't know because because Rogers is actually incorporated in British Columbia, which people don't know because their headquarters are here in Toronto, but they're incorporated in BC, which is something that Ted had done back in the day for various reasons, including tax reasons. And so it's the BC Corporations Act that is unique in allowing for a board to be reconstituted essentially without holding a meeting of the shareholders. Now, even if Rogers did have a shareholder meeting, it's pretty clear what would have happened, which is that Edward would have gotten his way because 97.5% of the voting stock of Rogers is held within trusts that Edward controls. However, by having a shareholder meeting, it would have bought some time. The shareholders could have come out and asked questions, asked for some rationale as to why these changes were being contemplated, because of course at that point, Edward had said very little about why he wanted to make these leadership changes, and both at the management level and at the board. And so, it would have allowed for greater transparency.
Well, let me pick up on that, because you've approached this book very much like a reporter. You are getting all sides, you're putting the information out there, and basically the reader is going to make up his or her own decision. But I wonder whether you came to any conclusions yourself as to, because at the end of the day, this is a bit of a story about governance and about, who's allowed to do what, and is this any way to run a railroad? Did you come to any conclusions about that yourself?
Well, as a reporter, my personal belief is always in holding power to account, and it's in transparency. And one of the things that I have found surprising throughout reporting on this saga is that there's this whole Byzantine structure at the very top of Rogers Communications that doesn't allow for a lot of transparency. So, for example, when you look at the Rogers Control Trust, it has this advisory committee of 10 members. Most of these are Rogers family members and Rogers family member friends. And technically, the company does not even have to disclose changes to the structure of this committee. And so as public shareholders, those of us who own shares of Rogers that don't give the ability to vote on major decisions, such as the board and leadership and major transactions and other things of that nature, it would put, I believe, the Class B, the subordinated shareholders, on a more equal footing with the Class A shareholders to at least have the ability to see more of what's happening in, for example, changes to this advisory committee, things that are happening at the trust level. And so, as a journalist, my main priority has been to bring as much transparency to the issue. Obviously, a lot of things that have happened here in the story, they're quite anomalous, right? We don't see this kind of very public feud in the ranks of a very wealthy, very prominent, and very powerful family in Canada very often.
Ted Rogers' daughter, Martha, was on Twitter a lot, absolutely carving her brother a new one on regular occasions. How did everybody deal with that?
Some of those tweets, actually funny you should mention that, some of those tweets were actually submitted by Edward's lawyers in court. Look, in the end, what ended up happening is that, the reason why I was not able to, for instance, sit down and have, lengthy on-the-record interviews with members of the Rogers family is because they had all agreed to this standstill that essentially prevented them from being able to say anything to the press that might be seen as disparaging of one another until the deal closed, because we did have this conflict break out at this very crucial moment while the deal was still in the works, and nobody wanted to jeopardize that. And so I think it was largely in response to those tweets and to a couple of interviews that Melinda gave, one to me at the Globe and another to Bloomberg, that standstill agreement came to be.
She got in trouble for doing that.
She certainly did.
Yeah, she did. You ever see the TV show Succession?
Of course I have, obsessively.
I always thought that was a
Great
show about the Murdochs, but it turns out it might very well have been about the Rogerses. And there is a moment, I think, do we have this clip? Are we going to play this clip? I hope we're bleeping this clip because, okay, set it up again. Brian Cox, who's the head of Waystar Royco, he is the head of this very dysfunctional family, but he's a phenomenal character. He gets hired by somebody to do a video for Edward Rogers. Okay, I'm not going to say any more. Let's just, okay, let's play it. Go ahead, Sheldon.
Edward, this is from Suzanne. Congratulations on your real-life succession at Rogers Communications, and also having Joe Natale to the off. Well done, Edward. Congratulations.
That's actually mildly bad language compared to what he has said in the TV show. But anyway, when you guys broke that story, right?
We did.
At the Globe Mail.
That's right.
When you first saw it, first of all, okay, I know you're not going to answer this, but I'm going to ask anyway. How'd you get a hold of that?
I have my sources.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. When you first saw it, what'd you think?
For me, this was such a bizarre moment because I had been covering this saga while the third season of Succession was playing out on HBO simultaneously, which was such a crazy thing in the first place. And then when I saw this video, it was just like the walls between fiction and reality came crumbling down because now the two storylines are crossing over into each other. And so it was this kind of mind-blowing moment for me. I think I watched that clip 4 or 5 times in a row before I even, told anyone that I had it. I don't think Joe Natale was as impressed with this clip as perhaps other people may have been.
Do you know whether Edward enjoyed the clip?
So what I reported in my book and what has come out in court files is that he sent it around to various family and friends.
Which presumably you don't do if you didn't think it was kind of cool.
That's right.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.